This is problem number 4 from the Chapter 10 closure packet. Solve each quadratic equation using any method. Describe the answers as rational or irrational numbers. So first of all, in the directions it says to solve. So I want to get x equals some number in these problems, and you can use any method you want. We know 3 ways to solve these quadratics. We can do factoring and the zero product property, we can do completing the square, and we can do the quadratic formula. And the last part of the directions say to describe the answers as rational or irrational numbers. So in order to do this, you have to actually get the answers first, and then we'll talk about what rational and irrational numbers are. So for part 8, I think a lot of us like to do factoring, which is with the generic rectangle and diamond. So I'm going to start by doing that. 2x squared, oops, you can't see that. 2x squared, and then minus 5. Right, the first and the last numbers go in those boxes, and I multiply those together to get negative 10x squared, and I'm going to get negative 1x on the bottom. That middle term is what goes on the bottom. So things that multiply to 10, I could have 5 and 2, 1 and 10, and if I try to think of those combinations that'll get me a 1, those aren't 1 away from each other at all. So really this problem is not going to be factorable. So it's not factorable, but I still need to try to solve it. I can still solve it. So don't just say there's no solution. There might be no solution, but we have to prove that using another method. This just means they're not going to be perfectly nice numbers. So let's do the quadratic formula, because I think that's everyone's second favorite and something that we should practice. So I'm going to write the quadratic formula for you first. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, all divided by 2a. Okay? So let's identify which values are a, b, and c first in the equation. So right here, this 2 is going to be a. Negative 1, which is the number in front of the x, is going to be b. And the number by itself is going to be c. Okay? So we have our a, b, and c right there. So we're going to plug those into our equation. So x equals negative, or I like to think of this as the opposite of b. b is already a negative 1, so the opposite of negative 1 is positive 1. Plus or minus the square root of b squared. b was just negative 1, so negative 1 squared. Make sure you put that in parentheses, and you're going to type it in just like I have it here. Minus 4 times a, which is 2, times c, which is negative 5. Right, all divided by 2 times a, which was worth 2. All right, so we have that. So now I'm going to type in underneath the square root sign. I'm going to try to show you on my calculator right here. So I'm going to type in without the square root sign. So I'm going to do negative 1 squared minus 4 times 2 times negative 5. So I just did those little times things instead of parentheses. So underneath the square root, you should get a 41. Okay? So I'm going to say x equals 1 plus or minus the square root of 41 divided by 4, right? 2 times 2 will be a 4 down there. So now I'm going to split this up into 2 parts. I'm going to type it in 2 different ways on my calculator to get 2 answers. So I'm going to type in 1 plus the square root of 41 and then divide that number by 4. So 1 plus square root of 41, and I'm going to hit enter or equals. So I get some crazy thing divided by 4, because that's what my denominator says. So one of my answers, if I round it, it's 1.85. So that's one of my x's. X equals 1.85. Now really, I'm rounding it so I don't write all those numbers down. But on the calculator, you can see that it's kind of crazy. There's no real pattern. So that's going to kind of tell us something about, is it rational or irrational? But let's find our other answer first. So I'm going to do, I did x plus the square root of 41 divided by 4. I'm going to do 1 minus the square root of 41. Hit enter. And then divide that by 4. So I get negative 1.35 other craziness. Okay? So x equals negative 1.35. So those are my 2 values for x if I rounded to the nearest hundredths place. And is this a rational or irrational number? Both of them have crazy decimals that do not form a pattern. If I try to, I don't even know what this would do. It doesn't even make it into a fraction. It can't even do it. So these are both called irrational numbers. So right here. So you need this in part of your answer as well. So they're irrational numbers right there because they repeat and they go on forever without repeating, actually. So they just are a crazy weird pattern. So we have to solve it. Even if you can't factor it, you still have to solve it. So the next one, we're going to try the same thing, except this one needs to equal 0 first. So I'm going to subtract 4x, that moves this one over. And I'm going to add 1, because that'll get rid of this. So I'm going to put it all on one side now, and it'll say 4x squared minus 4x plus 1 equals 0. Okay? So let's try to factor this one again, because we're still solving. So I have 4x squared in the bottom left, and a 1 in the top right. Diamond, I get a 4x squared. And the bottom of my diamond is negative 4x. It's the middle number from this equation right here. So things that multiply to 4, I could have 4 and 1, 2 and 2. None of those are really going to get me to a negative 4. So again, not factorable. Right, but even if you get not factorable on there, and if it tells you to solve it, you need to keep going. If it says to factor, then you would say you can't do it. But I need to solve it, and that means I keep going. So I'm going to use the same quadratic formula from over here. Let's identify our A's, B, and C's. This 4 is worth A, negative 4 is B, and positive 1 is C. Okay, so if you have your equation in order, going from the highest exponent down, they should just go in order like this. So I'm going to write x equals, this is this problem right here, negative, or the opposite of b. b is already negative 4, so the opposite of that is positive 4, plus or minus the square root of b squared, b was negative 4, minus 4, that's 4 is always a minus 4, times a times c, all divided by 2 times a. Okay? So again, I'm going to show you on the calculator what you should be getting. So you might like to type in the square root symbol and then the numbers underneath, or just the numbers underneath, and that's kind of what I like to do first. So I have negative 4 squared. Notice the squared is on the outside of the parentheses. Minus 4 times 1. Okay. So that's the number underneath the square root, which is a 0. Move that aside for a second. So I have x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 0 divided by 2 times 4 would give me an 8. Okay. So the square root of 0 is 0. So really I have 4 plus nothing, which is still 4, divided by 8, which I can write as 1/2. And then I have 4 minus 0, which is still 4, divided by 8 is 1/2 again. So I only have one answer this time, because my 0 was under the square root. And that will happen. Whenever you get a 0 under the square root sign, you'll just have the one answer, because it doesn't change. You're not adding or subtracting anything. So now, is this rational or irrational? So rational means that it stops, and it is something you can write as a fraction. Right? These ones, my calculator couldn't even change them into fractions because they were crazy. So this one is called rational. So most of the numbers, if we call them, kind of nice numbers or fractions, they're going to be rational. Crazy things, like these numbers that repeated on the calculator, are going to be called irrational with an I in front. Okay, so make sure that you read the directions if it says to solve, and if you are supposed to solve, you need to do whatever method it takes until you get an answer. Don't just stop and say one does not work.